Everyone on the Alvarez estate lived by one lethal rule: stay away from Charlie and Cooper. These weren't just pets. They were living weapons that had hospitalized 3 professional handlers, shredded reinforced leather leashes, and left the most hardened security guards paralyzed with fear. No one dared to get near them without a barrier. Not even Alvarez himself, despite his 300 pounds of tattooed muscle. So, when the courtyard gate swung open on a Tuesday morning and a small 9-year-old girl in a bright red dress stepped onto the asphalt, every guard's blood ran cold. The twin beasts lunged, their muscles coiling like compressed springs as they let out a snarl of pure aggression that vibrated through the mansion walls. The guards reached for their weapons, and Elena, the housekeeper, let out a scream of pure maternal terror. But little Francesca didn't run. She didn't even flinch. She simply walked forward with a steady gaze and raised one small hand toward the charging monsters. "Sit," she commanded. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. In a moment that made every criminal in that fortress question the nature of power, the 2 beasts everyone feared dropped to their hunches and sat perfectly still at her feet. From his second-floor balcony, Alvarez stood frozen in disbelief. He had built an empire on intimidation, but he had never once gotten his own dogs to obey him. This child had just revealed the one thing Alvarez spent decades denying: that fear isn't respect, and control is not the same as leadership. The Alvarez estate was a fortress disguised as a luxury mansion, sprawling across acres of manicured lawns and protected by towering iron gates. Inside these walls, Alvarez had built his empire through a single, brutal principle: make people more afraid of you than they are of anything else. His name alone was a map of violence, and his body, covered in ink and muscle, was a testament to the iron grip he maintained over his territory. But 2 years ago, that grip had failed him. The twin Pitbulls had arrived as the ultimate addition to his arsenal of intimidation, 140 pounds each of pure predatory instinct. Instead of becoming his best enforcers, they became his greatest embarrassment. The first handler lasted only 3 days before being mauled. The second was sent down a marble staircase with a shattered wrist. By the time the third handler ended up in the hospital with deep puncture wounds, the staff began navigating the mansion like soldiers in a war zone, always listening for the click of claws on marble. Professional trainers doubled their fees and then quit. Shock collars only made the dogs more volatile. Alvarez was reduced to shouting commands from a safe distance, relying on reinforced leashes that were constantly on the verge of snapping. The dogs respected no one and answered to nobody, serving as living proof that some things could not be beaten into submission. Elena had worked as the housekeeper for 7 years, learning the art of being invisible to survive in a world of secrets and violence. But that morning, a water main break at the local school forced her to make the hardest phone call of her career. Alvarez, who didn't do children, finally gave a curt order to keep the child out of the way and far from the dogs. Francesca arrived in her favorite red dress, carrying a backpack of books and an observant intelligence that adults often mistook for shyness. While everyone else warned her about the big black monsters, Francesca simply nodded politely. Her mother set her up in a sitting room far from the east wing, but as Elena disappeared to work, Francesca's attention drifted to the window. Below, she saw the massive shapes circling the courtyard, not like monsters, but like prisoners memorizing the inches of their cell. In their restless pacing, she recognized a helpless anger she had felt many times before, and she decided she was no longer going to stay invisible. The scent of floor wax and expensive citrus hung heavy in the kitchen, a domestic perfume that usually meant the master of the house was in a foul mood. Francesca sat at the small, scarred wooden table, her math book open to a page of fractions that felt meaningless compared to the drama unfolding outside. Her mother, Elena, was a whirlwind of anxiety, her hands trembling as she polished silver that already shone like mirrors. "Stay away from the glass, mi vida," Elena whispered for the 10th time, her eyes darting toward the heavy oak door that led to the courtyard. But the window was a magnet, and Francesca's curiosity, was a force more powerful than her mother's fear. When Elena retreated to the pantry to organize the fine china, Francesca slid off her chair, her red dress rustling softly against the white tile. She moved with the silent grace of a child used to being overlooked, eventually pressing her nose to the cool, thick glass of the kitchen window that overlooked the east wing. Below, the twin Pitbulls were in motion. From this height, they didn't look like the demons the guards described. They looked like shadows carved from muscle, trapped in a relentless, agonizing loop. They paced the perimeter of the stone path with a mechanical precision that made Francesca's heart tighten. They weren't hunting, they were patrolling a prison they hadn't built. Every few seconds, the larger one would stop at the iron gate, his lip curling back to reveal rows of ivory teeth. To the guards in the security booth, it was a display of lethal intent. To Francesca, it was a silent, desperate scream. She watched the way his tail remained tucked, the way his ears flicked at every slamming car door or barked command from a soldier. She looked closer, peering past the snarling muzzles and the heavy, brass-studded collars that looked more like shackles than jewelry. She saw their eyes. They weren't filled with the joy of the kill. They were clouded with the fatigue of a never-ending war. They were bored, lonely, and vibrating with a nervous energy that had nowhere to go but into their teeth. They were exactly like the men who stood at the gates, broken by Alvarez's world, then blamed for being sharp. A sudden realization washed over her, making her breath fog the glass in a small, white cloud. They weren't waiting for someone to kill. They were waiting for someone to listen. In that quiet, sun-drenched kitchen, as her mother's frantic cleaning hummed in the background, Francesca realized she wasn't looking at monsters. She was looking at two spirits who had forgotten how it felt to be anything else. She didn't feel the chill of fear that had turned the rest of the estate to ice. Instead, she felt a strange, heavy kinship. They were both small pieces in Alvarez's giant, violent game, and for the first time in her 9 years, Francesca decided she was done playing by his rules. The humidity of the afternoon felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the manicured lawns of the estate. Marco, Alvarez's most trusted enforcer, stepped into the courtyard with the swagger of a man who believed he held the world on a chain. In his hand was a heavy, braided leather lead reinforced with steel wire, and in the other, a high-voltage cattle prod. He didn't see animals. He saw malfunctioning equipment that needed to be shocked into compliance. Alvarez watched from the shaded balcony, his arms crossed over his tattooed chest, a silent judge of the dominance he demanded from his men and his beasts alike. "Move, you bastards," Marco growled, the crackle of electricity sparking in the stagnant air as he jabbed at the air. The Pitbulls didn't move. They were statues of black muscle, their eyes fixed not on the prod, but on the pulsing vein in the man's neck. Francesca watched from the kitchen window, her small hand pressed so hard against the glass that her knuckles turned white. She saw what Marco missed, the subtle lowering of their heads, the way their weight shifted to their hindquarters, and that terrifying, absolute silence that precedes a storm. It happened in the heartbeat between a breath and a scream. As Marco lunged to strike the smaller dog, the larger one didn't flinch. It acted. With a roar that sounded less like a canine bark and more like a tectonic plate snapping, the beast lunged. The reinforced leather gave a sickening, rhythmic pop-pop-pop as the fibers failed one by one. The leash didn't just break. It vanished under the sheer force of concentrated fury. The courtyard became a blur of ink, teeth, and crimson. Marco's scream was short-lived, swallowed by the guttural snarls of the dogs as they tore through his expensive Italian suit and the myth of his authority. Guards scrambled, their boots skidding on the stone pathway, but the dogs were a synchronized whirlwind of carnage. They weren't just attacking a man. They were shredding the concept of the leash itself. Alvarez's face went pale, the ink on his skin standing out like bruises against his suddenly ashen complexion. He saw his top man reduced to a heap of broken pride and torn flesh in a matter of seconds. The blood began to pool on the white stone, a dark, spreading stain that mocked the sterile luxury of the mansion. As the guards finally surrounded the beasts with rifles raised, Alvarez felt the foundation of his world tilt. The tools were broken. The weapons had turned. In the chilling silence that followed the carnage, as Marco was dragged away and the dogs were herded into their reinforced steel cages with catch poles, Alvarez's hand drifted to the cold, heavy pistol at his side. He didn't see a tragedy. He saw a liability that had to be liquidated. The execution was no longer a question. It was a necessity. The smell of iron and ozone lingered in the air, a metallic ghost of the violence that had just unfolded. Alvarez moved through the corridors of his home not as a king, but as a janitor preparing to scrub a permanent stain from the floor. His heavy boots made a hollow, rhythmic thud against the polished marble, a sound that echoed like a funeral drum. In his right hand, he carried a heavy-duty tactical lead, not for control, but for transport, and tucked into the small of his back was the customized silver-plated Colt .45 that had settled 1,000 disputes. To Alvarez, there was no room for sentimentality in an empire. A weapon that recoiled on its owner was simply scrap metal. He reached the heavy steel door of the holding pens, his jaw set in a line of jagged glass. Inside, the twin Pitbulls were unnervingly quiet. They didn't bark as he approached. They didn't even snarl. They stood in the shadows of their enclosure, their muscular chests heaving, their eyes tracking his every movement with a haunting, human-like intelligence. Alvarez felt a flicker of something he refused to call regret. He had raised them to be monsters, had fed their rage until it was a bonfire, and now that the fire had jumped the hearth, he was the only one left to extinguish it. "Come," he grunted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He snapped the heavy clips onto their collars. The dogs followed him out into the blinding midday sun of the yard, their claws clicking sharply against the hot asphalt. It was a slow, grim procession. The guards stood back, lining the perimeter like silent sentinels, their faces masks of grim satisfaction or hidden terror. They watched the man they feared lead the beasts they loathed toward the far end of the garden, past the fountain that sang a cheerful, oblivious song. Francesca watched from the second-floor balcony, her small heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the way the sun glinted off the silver barrel of the gun Alvarez had now pulled from his waistband. She saw the dogs, their heads low, walking toward their end with a strange, tragic dignity. They weren't fighting him. They weren't lunging. It was as if they knew the weight of the man's shadow and had finally accepted that in this world, there was no place for things that couldn't be broken. Alvarez stopped in the center of the clearing, the heat of the sun reflecting off the ink on his arms. He took a deep breath, his finger ghosting over the trigger, the world narrowing down to the space between the hammer and the firing pin. The silence in the courtyard was absolute, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. Alvarez stood like a monolith of stone and ink, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. He leveled the silver barrel of the Colt .45, the muzzle steady as a mountain, aimed directly at the space between the larger dog's eyes. The pitbull didn't flinch. It simply looked at him, its breathing shallow, waiting for the final thunder. The guards held their collective breath, their fingers twitching on their own weapons, bracing for the inevitable crack of the shot that would close this violent chapter. Then the world broke. A streak of vibrant, impossible crimson shattered the monochrome tension. Francesca didn't scream. She didn't warn anyone. She simply moved. She bolted from the side entrance, her red dress billowing behind her like a silk flame, a bright heartbeat pulsing against the gray, dead background of the fortress. Elena's voice finally tore through the air from the balcony above, a jagged, raw wail of "no" that came a second too late. Francesca had already crossed the dead zone, her small frame blurring past the stunned guards who were too shocked to intercept her. She didn't stop until she was mere inches from the dogs, her tiny body positioned directly in the line of fire. She stood between the executioner and the condemned, a fragile shield of innocence that made the heavy steel of the pistol look suddenly pathetic. Alvarez's finger froze on the trigger. The sight of her, small, resolute, and radiating a calm that shouldn't exist in this house of shadows, sent a jolt through his system that no rival's blade ever could. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his tattooed arm trembling as he fought the momentum of his own lethal intent. The dogs reacted instantly. The larger one, who seconds ago had been a statue of resignation, let out a low, confused whimper. Francesca didn't look at the gun. She didn't even look at Alvarez. Her focus was entirely on the beasts. She reached out, her hand steady and small, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The guards, the guns, the empire, and the blood on the stones faded into the background, leaving only a little girl in a red dress standing in a circle of monsters, refusing to let the light go out. Alvarez stared down the sight of his weapon, not at a target, but at the unthinkable truth. His world of force had finally met something it couldn't command. The heavy silence was broken only by the frantic, ragged breathing of the beasts and the distant, frantic sobbing of Elena from the balcony. Alvarez's gun remained leveled, his knuckles white against the silver grip, his mind screaming for the girl to move. The lead pitbull, a creature of scarred hide and knotted muscle, let out a final, guttural snarl, its body tensing for one last, desperate lunge at the man who had only ever offered it chains. But Francesca didn't flinch. She took one more step, closing the distance until she was within reach of the jaws that had shredded steel. With a slow, deliberate grace, she reached out. Her hand was impossibly small against the dog's massive, blocky head, her skin a stark, pale contrast to its dark fur. The guards held their breath, expecting to see the crimson of her dress matched by something far more macabre. Instead, as her fingers made contact, softly scratching the sensitive skin behind the dog's tattered ear, the beast froze. The terrifying tension that had defined its existence for years seemed to evaporate in a single, shivering second. The snarling muzzle eased, the jagged teeth vanished, and the predatory light in its eyes flickered and died, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. The great beast didn't strike. It collapsed. Its massive legs gave way as it sank onto the hot asphalt, letting out a long, broken whimper that sounded more like a sob than a canine cry. The second dog, sensing the sudden shift in the air, mirrored the movement, dropping its head and tucking its tail in a gesture of absolute, unforced surrender. Francesca didn't stop. She knelt into the dirt, her red dress fanning out around her like a protective halo, and pulled the lead dog's heavy head into her lap. She began to murmur words that no one else could hear, a low, rhythmic humming that acted as a sedative to the violence of the courtyard. Alvarez lowered the Colt .45, the weight of the weapon suddenly feeling like lead in his hand. He stared at the scene, his mouth slightly agape, the calculated coldness of his worldview shattered by a 9-year-old's touch. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the best trainers money could buy, men who used electricity, spiked collars, and brute force, and they had all failed. Yet here was the daughter of his housekeeper, a child he had barely noticed, achieving total submission not through the fear of death, but through the offering of peace. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city felt completely and utterly powerless. He looked at his own tattooed hands, then at hers, realizing that the beast he had been trying to kill was the only one in the yard that truly understood what it meant to be cared for. The following weeks saw the estate transformed into a laboratory of quiet rebellion. Alvarez did not return the dogs to their reinforced steel cages. Instead, he allowed them to remain in the east courtyard, a decision that sent ripples of unease through his security detail. He found himself retreating to the darkened corners of the upper gallery, a ghost in his own home, watching through the ornate balustrades as the girl in the red dress dismantled his philosophy of power. He had officially tasked Francesca with fixing the animals, a command that was as much a test for the girl as it was for the beasts, but as he watched, he realized she wasn't training them at all. She was simply existing with them. From his vantage point in the shadows, Alvarez saw the dogs differently than he ever had before. Without the heavy, brass-studded collars and the constant threat of the shock prod, They moved with a fluid, relaxed grace that he hadn't known they possessed. Francesca didn't use a whistle or a whip. She used consistency. She moved at the same pace every morning, brought the same scraps from the kitchen, and spoke in the same unwavering, melodic tone. She would sit on the stone steps for hours, reading her math books aloud, and the two monsters, the killers who had shred Marco's reputation and flesh, would lie at her feet like furry sphinxes, their ears twitching at the sound of her voice. Alvarez found his fascination growing, a strange, uncomfortable curiosity that gnawed at his gut. He was a man who understood shipping lanes, black markets, and the precise cost of a life, but he could not quantify the influence this child held. He watched her lift their heavy paws to inspect for splinters, a task that would have cost any of his men a hand, and the dogs merely licked her wrists in a display of docility that felt like a personal insult to his methods. He saw the way the dog's eyes tracked her every movement with a devotion that bordered on worship, a loyalty that he realized, with a sudden, sharp pang of envy, he had never truly commanded from his own soldiers. His men noticed the change, too. The guards began to stand a little straighter when the girl passed, their hands no longer hovering over their holsters. The air in the mansion, once thick with the stagnant scent of fear, began to clear, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. Alvarez remained in the shadows, his fingers tracing the tattoos on his arms, beginning to understand that the girl wasn't just training the dogs. She was training the house. She was showing them all that the unthinkable wasn't her bravery, but the realization that his iron grip had been the only thing keeping them all in the dark. The fragile peace of the estate shattered at 3 a.m, not with a roar, but with the muffled click of a suppressed pistol and the scent of ozone. A rival syndicate, sensing the perceived softening of the Alvarez fortress, had slipped through the blind spot near the eastern hedges, the very gap Francesca had used to walk home. 3 shadows moved with the precision of ghosts, their target the master suite where Alvarez slept. But to reach the stairs, they had to cross the courtyard, a space they assumed was guarded only by 2 broken dogs and a few tired men. Francesca, stirred by a restless dream, had wandered onto the interior balcony overlooking the hall. She saw the flash of a blade in the moonlight before the guards did. Her intake of breath was tiny, but in the sudden, electric silence of the house, it was enough. The lead assassin looked up, his eyes cold and devoid of mercy, and leveled his weapon at the girl who had seen too much. He saw a child. He did not see the 2 shadows detached from the darkness behind her. Before he could pull the trigger, the air was ripped apart by a sound that didn't resemble a dog's bark. It was a primeval, bone-chilling roar of protection. Charlie and Cooper did not wait for a command. They did not wait for a leash to be slipped. They moved as a single, devastating force of nature. There was no hesitation, no fear of the gunfire that erupted into the stone floor. They launched themselves not out of a conditioned drive to kill, but with the desperate, focused ferocity of guardians defending their heart. The courtyard turned into a chaotic blur of silver moonlight and crimson splatters. The assassins, trained to handle men and machines, were completely unprepared for the sheer, unbridled fury of animals who were no longer fighting for their lives, but for the one person who had given them a reason to live. Alvarez burst from his suite, gun in hand, only to stop dead at the railing. He watched as his Pitbulls, once his greatest failure, neutralized the threat with a terrifying efficiency that far surpassed his most elite soldiers. When the last intruder was pinned, the dogs didn't continue to tear. They didn't lapse into a feral frenzy. Instead, as soon as the danger was quelled, they turned back to the stairs. They ignored the blood on their coats and the adrenaline in their veins, trotting to the base of the steps where Francesca stood trembling. They sat perfectly still, their heavy heads bowed, waiting for her hand. Alvarez watched his dogs look at the girl with a devotion that no amount of pain or pay could ever buy. In the cooling silence of the night, he finally understood. Fear had made them weapons, but love had made them invincible. The morning sun rose over the estate, casting long, golden fingers across the courtyard that only hours before had been a battlefield. The air was unnervingly still, but the atmosphere had shifted. The heavy, electric hum of fear that had defined the Alvarez fortress for years had finally evaporated. Alvarez descended the marble staircase, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't look at the cleaning crews scrubbing the stones or the guards who stood at a new, respectful distance. His eyes were fixed on the center of the garden where Francesca sat, her red dress dusty, her small hands buried in the thick fur of the two beasts who had saved them all. In his hands, Alvarez carried the heavy, brass-studded leather collars, the symbols of his failed philosophy. He stopped before the trio, the shadow of his massive frame falling over them. For a moment, the guards tensed, expecting a return to the old ways, but Alvarez simply knelt. With a pair of heavy industrial shears, he did the unthinkable. He didn't tighten the hold, he cut. The thick leather gave way with a rhythmic snap, and the shackles that had defined Charlie and Cooper fell to the asphalt like discarded skin. The dogs shook themselves, their necks free for the first time in their lives, and leaned into the man's tattooed shins. Alvarez looked up at Francesca, seeing not just a child, but the architect of a new world. He realized that the gap in his hedges hadn't been his greatest security flaw, the gap in his heart had been. He stood and turned to his assembled men, his voice no longer a roar of intimidation, but a calm, clear bell of authority. "The leashes are gone," he stated, his gaze sweeping over the soldiers who had lived by his terror. "From today, we don't lead by making people afraid to leave. We lead by making them want to stay." It was a wisdom that shook the foundation of his empire more than any bullet ever could. He wasn't giving up his power. He was finally learning how to use it. As the estate settled into this new, quiet strength, Alvarez walked back toward the mansion, the two dogs following at his heels, not because they were tied, but because they were home. The unthinkable had become the new law of the land, that the strongest hand is the one that knows when to let go. Thank you for following the journey of Francesca and the beasts of the Alvarez estate. This story reminds us that true power isn't found in a clenched fist, but in the courage to show mercy. If this tale of redemption and unthinkable bravery touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more high-stakes storytelling. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new chapter in our world of shadows and light. Comment below with loyalty if you believe that respect is earned, not forced. We'll see you in the next story.